made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
The British monarchy was no stranger to internal warfare, historic betrayals, or crown crises. Yet nothing could have braced the public for the decree King Charles was about to unveil. As the royal inner circle assembled behind closed doors, with Camilla waiting just a short distance away, the sovereign authorized a proclamation that would instantly shatter her destiny. Her days as queen were officially over. What unfolded next extended far beyond a mere adjustment of formal addresses. It signaled the total unraveling of a pledge once considered unbreakable. Before we dissect what this tectonic shift means for the future of the monarchy, hit that subscribe button to ensure you catch every breaking royal revelation. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, Charles recognized that everyone sensed the arrival of an irreversible turning point. Responding to an immediate command, William arrived alongside Catherine, while Anne walked in unaccompanied, casting a single watchful glance toward her nephew. Camilla remained in a nearby room, insulated from the monarch by a single shut door. Seated at his desk with two trusted counselors, the king reviewed the concluding sentences twice. This official sovereign decree, drafted directly in the monarch's name, dictated that she must relinquish the title of queen, step away from all constitutional obligations tied to the crown, and revert to her previous public designation as the Duchess of Cornwall. His fountain pen hovered momentarily above the parchment. Charles questioned if any alternative existed that could safeguard the institution without fracturing his marriage. Yet both aides remained completely silent. The crown demanded legal dominance, public selflessness, and an absolute commitment to protect the dynasty over personal devotion. Lowering his hand, he executed the signature. Camilla stood frozen as the private secretary stepped into the room. Remaining on her feet, she scanned the opening phrases of the document before slowly sinking into a chair. Her expression grew completely rigid upon reaching the final lines. The text contained zero mentions of failing health, a temporary sabbatical, or potential reinstatement. The decree was absolute. Her previous status would never be recovered, and the reality she had spent a lifetime fighting to establish dissolved the moment her husband signed the paper. William maintained an iron grip on his emotions when the family received the news. Catherine, however, could see the tension tightening his jawline. Anne perceived even more. Observing the young prince with intense scrutiny, she recognized that this outcome came as no surprise to him. The next sovereign had received far more than a simple advance warning. His total lack of surprise implied he had actively participated in drafting the terms. Catherine looked into his eyes, searching for some form of comfort, but his expression remained unreadable. Folding the documents neatly, Camilla commanded the secretary to stay. Her tone was barely a whisper, yet the query sliced directly through the palace quietude. Who engineered this betrayal? Moments later, those very words reached Charles, the raw agony behind them, exposing a psychological fracture far more profound than any debate over titles. Yet this crisis could never be fully grasped through dry legal documents alone, because behind the formal language stood four individuals whose deepest anxieties had finally collided. To the public, the decree was a political earthquake, but within the private quarters of the estate, it was a devastating personal execution. For Charles, it jeopardized the bond he had shielded for decades. For Camilla, it wiped away the ultimate prize for which she had endured years of public scorn. For William, it was the ultimate triumph of obligation over empathy. And for Catherine, it revealed a fundamental family rupture that her diplomacy could no longer conceal. Charles had dedicated decades to safeguarding Camilla's position by his side, shielding her from unrelenting public disapproval and meticulously restoring the societal standing she once feared was permanently ruined. He had framed their union as a foundational pillar of his court's stability, meaning that stripping her of her title now felt like erasing a vital chapter of his own legacy. Camilla recognized that institutional cost, but the sting of personal betrayal weighed far heavier than palace politics. Sheltered away with her sister Annabelle, she clutched the decree, confessing during their confidential talk that she had outlasted years of national vitriol solely because the sovereign had sworn she would never be treated as disposable again. Annabelle attempted to offer reassurance. However, the consort's fury was triggered by much more than a loss of rank. It stemmed from public disgrace, immense sacrifice, and the terrifying realization that everything she had sacrificed had been invalidated by a single stroke of a pen. William bore a completely different responsibility. As the immediate successor to the crown, He viewed the throne not as a piece of property owned by the current generation, but as a sacred trust held for those yet to come. Catherine approached that exact same principle from a maternal perspective. She knew that every unresolved feud within the palace would eventually cast a shadow over their own offspring, and she had already detected these underlying hostilities bleeding into matters concerning their own court. The princess vividly recalled instances where Camilla had openly challenged their staff regarding palace access, ceremonial hierarchy, the official protocol dictating royal placement and precedence, and organizational matters tied directly to the Wales family. While Catherine had maintained a polite demeanor, she secretly recorded every single confrontation, realizing that remaining silent was no longer shielding anyone. Anne displayed far less hesitation. In a private conversation with William, she cautioned that sentimentality could not be allowed to cause institutional paralysis. She revealed, through a detailed log of previous administrative conferences, that Charles had repeatedly hesitated to take action, even when senior courtiers warned him that the internal warfare was becoming impossible to manage. The Princess Royal loved her brother deeply, but her primary allegiance was always to the monarchy he had taken an oath to uphold. When Charles eventually walked into the private quarters later that evening, he found Camilla facing away from him. He attempted to argue that the decree was vital to insulate the institution, but she whirled around, asking if the crown had finally eclipsed the entire life they had built as a couple. The question left the king utterly speechless. Afterward, William confided in Catherine that this drastic measure would never have materialized without the explosive showdown that followed the Commonwealth event, a formal assembly uniting the ruler with the global network of Commonwealth territories. His tone shifted noticeably as he spoke of it, and she instantly recognized that the family had transitioned from underlying friction into open warfare. To comprehend why a reigning monarch would strip his own spouse of the very title he had spent a lifetime defending, one must look back to the exact night where internal disagreement transformed into open defiance. The flashpoint did not originate from a leaked memorandum or a brutal media story. It ignited within the historic walls of St. Regis, George's Hall, following the conclusion of the Commonwealth ceremony. Once the public had departed and the palace gates were secured, an event meant to be a standard family debriefing took a dangerous turn. Camilla openly defied an explicit directive from Charles and pushed a demand regarding William's future governance that instantly escalated an internal dispute into a full-scale royal emergency. For several months, she had watched significant administrative decisions bypass her entirely. William and Catherine were consistently brought into discussions first, briefed much earlier, and granted authorities that historically would have been funneled through her own staff. The Queen Consort interpreted this shift as something far more calculated than mere preparation for a future reign. She viewed it as a covert strategy to render her completely powerless while the king was still alive. The Commonwealth celebration, a cornerstone royal gathering celebrating the family of nations historically intertwined with Great Britain, forced that anxiety into the light. During the line of diplomatic introductions, palace handlers consistently deferred to Catherine for executive guidance. She managed the event with flawless poise, and the subsequent commendations from veteran aides only deepened Camilla's bitterness. The future queen had never sought the spotlight, yet she recognized its profound strategic value. Each flawless public showing solidified public faith in the next court, whereas any instability surrounding the reigning monarch made transition planning an absolute priority. Camilla brought that simmering resentment directly into the private meeting held in St. George's Hall, a majestic stateroom at Windsor Castle reserved for major dynastic events. Charles anticipated a brief recap of the day's proceedings. William expected a review of standard duties. Instead, she demanded absolute veto power over all future Commonwealth hospitality initiatives. The king flatly declined, clarifying that his son needed to start managing heavier institutional obligations. She refused to back down. Locking eyes with the prince across the conference table, Camilla directly accused him of establishing a shadow court, a competitive center of power, functioning right alongside the reigning king. She asserted to Charles that his successor was actively undermining his sovereignty before his reign had even concluded. The monarch commanded her to cease, but she slid a leather folder across the polished wood, demanding signed control over the ceremonial protocol of the Wales household. William sat motionless, though his absolute silence served as an ominous warning. Charles ordered his wife to withdraw the paperwork and consider the discussion finished. Snapping the folder shut, She looked straight at him and proclaimed that she refused to be treated as a placeholder while his son engineered their obsolescence. The atmosphere in the room froze. The king removed his spectacles, placed them quietly beside the state papers, and ordered everyone to exit except for Anne. The moment the double doors were locked, he confessed during their recorded private discussion that Camilla had elevated a simple household argument into a direct challenge to the line of succession, the systematic devolution of power to the next ruler. Anne pushed him to intervene decisively before internal pushback solidified into a permanent rebellion. That very night, Charles commanded his private secretary to launch a comprehensive audit of every luxury, legal power, and protocol function linked to his wife's status. The wheels had been set in motion. When Camilla discovered that Charles had quietly initiated the structural audit, she refused to retreat, sparking a confrontation that forced the couple to voice the bitter truths they had avoided for a generation. No veteran courtiers were present to tone down the language. No administrative secretaries were there to diffuse the arguments, and no relatives could step in to break the tension. Charles and Camilla stood nose to nose in the sovereign's private study, with nothing separating them except the unsigned decree resting on a mirror-polished table. What started as a desperate plea for a middle ground degenerated into the most agonizing argument of their entire marriage, the exact instant both realized that decades of affection could no longer shield them from reality. Camilla had forced the confrontation the moment she discovered her official privileges were being audited. Refusing to accept explanations filtered through intermediaries, she informed Charles that if he truly intended to dismantle her official life, he would have to look her in the eye while doing so. The monarch entered the room believing a compassionate compromise could still be achieved. His drafted settlement permitted her to keep the title of queen while systematically stripping away her administrative duties, staffing control, and household vetoes. The strategy was engineered to project total royal solidarity, maintaining the public illusion that the king and his inner circle were unified while quietly neutralizing the authority that had caused the friction. Camilla scanned the text once and shoved it away. She told him that a title stripped of real influence transformed her into a mere prop, adding that losing everything in the open would be far less degrading than playing along with a charade of relevance. Her delivery remained ice cold, but the words were devastating. William, she asserted, had been permitted to dictate the boundaries of their life from outside the room. Charles finally lost his temper. He shouted that this had absolutely nothing to do with his successor's ambition, but was entirely about her refusal to operate within the boundaries enforced by the sovereign, the ruling monarch, whose commands represent the ultimate authority within the royal court. Protecting her at this stage, he argued, would be tantamount to admitting that his own decrees could be bypassed without penalty. Camilla shot back that she had stood by him when the entire nation viewed their romance as an absolute disgrace to the country. He countered that marital affection could never pardon a direct assault on the next line of succession. The king then pulled open the dossier from St. George's Hall. Resting inside were written directives she had attempted to dispatch to high-ranking court officials, commanding them to circumvent the Wales staff and route all ceremonial choices straight to her desk. The Wales team represented the administrative staff managing William and Catherine's household. Charles laid the pages out in front of her, explaining that these documents transformed mere apprehension into undeniable proof. She stared at the evidence, then slowly slid her wedding band off her finger. For several agonizing seconds, the ring rested directly beside the unsigned decree. That quiet action carried more violence than any shouting match. Camilla slid the ring back on, stating that while she remained his spouse, she would never forgive being put on trial like a treacherous courtier. The consort walked out without looking back. Charles stood alone until the door clicked shut, crossed out the compromise clause, and called for his secretary. His recorded command was stark: prepare the final unconditional decree. Charles had made his emotional choice, yet transforming that personal decision into an unyielding state act required the explicit backing of those who manage succession protocol, historical precedent, and the legal machinery of the crown. Sovereign power almost never operates through shouted ultimatums. It executes via wax-sealed folders, meticulously choreographed conferences, and treaties finalized long before the public suspects a decision is looming. Backing Charles's decree was a quiet coalition consisting of the king, his successor, Princess Anne, and senior constitutional lawyers. Yet, the most crucial player in that chamber was not the most vocal. It was William, who fully recognized that endorsing this move would insulate his future reign while permanently fracturing his father's personal happiness. Charles walked into the secret council meeting at Windsor holding the final decree, yet he hesitated to place it on the conference table. He demanded absolute certainty that the monarchy could survive the fallout before he accepted the damage it would inflict on his home life. The constitutional assessment, a formal audit of the ruler's statutory powers and crown protocols, had confirmed that Camilla's official address, staff budget, and protocol roles existed entirely at the pleasure of the sovereign. The king possessed the legal right to revoke state recognition, dismantle her administrative staff, and strip her of public appearances conducted on behalf of the dynasty. Yet having the legal right did not make the execution any easier. William's explicit alignment remained vital, given that any resolution altering the next reign would dictate the absolute transfer of power following his father's death. A veteran advisor questioned if the queen consort should hold some residual authority during that future interregnum. The prince stared at a portrait of Charles, pausing deliberately before delivering his answer. Personal leniency, he stated firmly, could never override systemic clarity. His voice strained because he knew those words would reach the monarch not merely as counsel from an heir, but as a direct verdict from his son. Anne refused to let the committee shield themselves behind administrative jargon. The Princess Royal demanded to know if they were actively shielding the crown or merely executing a vendetta against Camilla. Charles remained silent. William eventually spoke up, clarifying that a vendetta would involve public degradation, whereas shielding the crown required an organized, dignified retirement from public life. Catherine's handwritten logs from previous administrative sessions then completely ended the debate. The documentation exposed systematic attempts by Camilla's team to interfere with Wales' family schedules, state event coordination, and staff hires. Catherine had documented these arguments confidentially because every single intrusion eroded the defined boundaries separating the current court from the future one. The blow-up at St. George's Hall was no random tantrum. It was the final movement in a calculated strategy that could no longer be tolerated. Charles accepted the collective judgment but demanded a single condition. Camilla would keep her private estate, absolute financial independence, state protection, and her status as his wife. The king would sever her from constitutional power, but he refused to allow the resolution to become an act of total banishment. Anne consented to the terms. William did as well, though the future king recognized that no amount of dignity could dull the betrayal. Charles signed the paper. Sealed directives instantly flew to palace administrators, ordering them to purge the queen's title from all state schedules, official letters, and future ceremonies. By sunrise, Camilla would witness her name being erased across the very dynasty she had broken barriers for decades to enter. The court had finalized its verdict in absolute secrecy, but no amount of silence could mask the immediate changes that erupted the moment Camilla's name was purged from the royal machinery. The decree materialized into reality not when news anchors broke the story, but when estate workers began physically dismantling the symbols of her former rank. Her schedule was wiped clean, her public engagements dissolved. Correspondence previously sent to Her Majesty was sent back stamped with a completely different form of address. Every single adjustment felt administrative, almost cold-blooded, yet collectively they tore down the identity she had spent a lifetime constructing, forcing everyone in her orbit to witness the raw human cost of royal discipline. Camilla's administrative footprint began evaporating before the morning meal. Her constitutional briefings were halted immediately, meaning she was cut off from the confidential state intelligence distributed to royals executing duties for the ruler. Engagements previously booked for her were reallocated to Anne, Catherine, and other working members of the dynasty. Charles commanded that every single adjustment be executed with utmost grace. There would be no forced eviction, no withdrawal of her security detail, and no public declaration implying their marriage was dissolved. The king sought to divorce the crown from his wife's authority, not wipe his wife completely out of his private life. Yet those institutional safeguards could do nothing to dull the reality unfolding right outside her office. Through her open door, Camilla watched as a maintenance worker arrived with a screwdriver and uninstalled the brass nameplate displaying her former title. The metallic echo of those screws turning carried far more weight than any formal state declaration. As he picked up the plate to transfer it to storage, she intervened, requesting that it be left on her writing desk. The former queen consort clutched the metal piece in both hands as Annabelle walked into the room. Her sister sat down beside her as she tried to crack a bitter joke about finally having a clear schedule, but the words cracked before she could deliver them. Camilla broke down into tears, confessing during their intimate conversation that she had prepared herself for media vitriol, anger, even a constitutional crisis, But she had never envisioned Charles personally signing off on the destruction of everything they had fought to build together. Annabelle whispered that she remained his wife, but she countered that being cherished in secret does nothing to erase being discarded in front of the entire world. A wave of official resignations landed by noon. A number of her longest-serving aides decided to step down rather than be absorbed into the newly structured royal court. Their fierce loyalty offered a brief moment of comfort, yet it simultaneously cemented the terrifying reality she faced. Her official office was not being downsized. It was being completely eradicated. Then, a handwritten letter from William arrived. The prince expressed deep regret for the emotional pain caused by the decree and swore she would never face public humiliation or banishment from family gatherings. He offered absolutely no apology for backing the declaration, and that brutal integrity unnerved her far more than hollow condolences ever could have. Senior counselors urged Camilla to launch a legal challenge against the terms, while devoted allies pushed her to fight back before the new protocol became permanent. She dismissed every single one of them, requesting instead a single face-to-face meeting with William, entirely free of Charles's legal representatives or palace executives. Stripped of her crown, but refusing to surrender to her fate, Camilla prepared to confront the man she believed had engineered the end of her reign alongside the king. For decades, Camilla and William had interacted solely through formal events, family obligations, and intensely calculated politeness. Now, there were no ceremonial uniforms, no senior advisors, and no ruling monarch seated between them. She stepped into the room convinced the successor had orchestrated her destruction. He entered fully aware that absolutely no words could give back what she had lost. Their private confrontation would never undo the signed decree, but it would determine whether the family imploded into open warfare or moved forward, simply carrying deep scars. Camilla intentionally chose a modest library within Clarence House rather than the grand settings of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. The location was critical because it stripped away the intimidating aura of state offices, transforming the encounter into a deeply personal reckoning between two individuals belonging to the same fractured dynasty. William arrived completely empty-handed, no legal documents, no strategy binders, and no press secretaries. Noticing his lack of materials, the prince informed her that he had not come to argue protocol. He had come to look her in the eye as Charles's child and the future sovereign, the individual destined to hold the next crown. Camilla cut straight to the core. She demanded to know if he had plotted her removal from the very beginning, and if every courteous conversation they had ever shared had merely masked that exact same personal judgment. William countered that he had fully embraced his father's marriage decades ago, emphasizing that he had never forced Charles to choose between his spouse and his son. However, the future king clarified that he could never tolerate competing spheres of influence around the throne, because having two separate commands would fracture staff loyalty, undermine the current king, and leave his own future reign poisoned before it even launched. The statement was painful, yet it lacked any malicious intent. William then explicitly validated the immense hardships she had survived to stand by the king. He noted that the family was fully aware of the decades of public vitriol, the merciless media coverage, and the unwavering emotional anchor she had provided Charles when his own path seemed precarious. Losing the crown, he explained, could never invalidate that lifetime of sacrifice. Camilla had braced herself for a harsh indictment. This unexpected validation shook her far more deeply. Her anger evaporated, and she admitted during their private talk that her choices had been entirely fueled by terror. Catherine's skyrocketing popularity and William's widening executive authority had made her feel like she was fading into total irrelevance. Every single demand she made for greater authority had been a desperate scramble to lock in permanence before the next court arrived. The constitutional line of authority, the explicit hierarchy governing who wields state power, simply has no room for you past my father's reign, William answered gently. But this family still does. He gave his word that she would always hold a cherished private position beside the king and within their personal family life, even though she would never again influence state policy. Following a prolonged pause, Camilla consented to let the decree stand without a fight. She requested only a single guarantee: that Charles would never be pressured to publicly denounce her. The prince gave his solemn oath. Then, she made a final executive decision. She would walk alongside the king one last time, not as the reigning queen, but purely as his wife, forcing the public to recognize that her capitulation did not mean she was being abandoned. Their confidential treaty completely neutralized the threat of an all-out civil war within the court. but the public had yet to witness how Camilla would conduct herself after relinquishing the crown from her name. By morning, the secret had breached the palace walls and completely captivated the nation. Television channels instantly canceled scheduled shows. Newspapers scrambled to overhaul their front pages, and massive crowds formed outside the gates of royal properties, analyzing every single movement behind the iron bars for deeper meaning. A segment of the public viewed the move as long overdue, while others condemned it as an act of absolute malice. Yet, a single stark image, Camilla standing right beside Charles without her queenly status, would completely silence the fiercest debates and define the entire era. Broadcast journalists labeled the proclamation the most shocking alteration to a living royal consort's status in modern history. A royal consort is defined as the legal spouse of a ruling king or queen, tasked with anchoring the sovereign without possessing any independent constitutional powers. Media analysts fought over whether Charles had acted out of sheer institutional survival or had simply bowed to intense pressure from his son and sister. The official palace statement worked quickly to anchor the unfolding chaos, confirming that Camilla remained the king's legal wife and a vital member of the family, though she would no longer execute any constitutional or ceremonial roles tied to the status of a queen. Loyalists spoke up for a woman who had survived decades of intense personal scrutiny, whereas detractors maintained that the monarchy could never endure two competing centers of power. By midday, Charles was being framed simultaneously as a hero and a villain. Some praised the king for prioritizing state duty over personal emotion, while others attacked him for abandoning the very title he had spent a lifetime fighting to secure for her. Catherine sensed the immense danger from her quarters at Kensington Palace. Monitoring the wall-to-wall news coverage alongside William, she grew deeply anxious that the public would blame her own escalating prominence for Camilla's sudden downfall. The princess recognized that every future public appearance she made as the next queen could now be twisted into proof of ruthless ambition rather than selfless service. William reached over, took her hand, and reminded her that shielding the crown occasionally requires absorbing public blame without offering a defense. The prince grasped the inherent cruelty of remaining silent, yet he likewise recognized that any public explanation would expose the exact family warfare they had sacrificed so much to contain. Right outside Buckingham Palace, the conceptual debate suddenly transformed into a physical reality. A massive crowd gathered directly beneath a colossal newspaper billboard displaying the stark headline, "The Queen No More," printed right above a photo of Camilla exiting Clarence House. Voices clashed, cameras flashed, and then her official vehicle rolled toward the security gates. The shouting crowd fell into a striking, collective silence. Hours later, she emerged alongside Charles for a brief departure from the palace grounds. Camilla walked precisely half a step behind him, entirely stripped of the royal insignia that had previously signaled her elevated rank. Royal insignia represents the official medals, badges, and state symbols that visually communicate an individual's formal placement in the hierarchy. Upon reaching the car, the king stopped, reached out his hand, and waited patiently until she was safely seated inside before entering himself. That single gesture gave back no title and reversed no legal decree, yet it completely transformed the narrative of the day. The entire nation understood that while Charles had completely purged Camilla from the legal architecture of queenship, he had absolutely no intention of removing her from his life. Once the media frenzy subsided and the heavy palace gates locked for the night, only a single evaluation mattered: what the decree had successfully salvaged, what it had permanently shattered, and what Camilla's ultimate surrender revealed about the nature of the crown. Camilla's destiny was no longer up for debate. She would never hold the title of queen again. Her official staff had been completely disbanded, her constitutional leverage was finished, and the exact title she once believed cemented her permanent acceptance had been stripped away by the very man who had fought the hardest to give it to her. Yet the true legacy of the proclamation was not found in public humiliation. It was found in the agonizing line Charles drew between the woman he cherished and the crown he had sworn a sacred oath to defend. Camilla formally embraced her lower status as the Duchess of Cornwall, relinquishing every state duty tied to queenship. The style represents the official designation and formal address granted to a royal individual, and her compliance proved that the settlement was completely final. Court calendars were permanently updated, ceremonial duties were reallocated to others, and absolutely no internal pushback followed. William's path as the immediate successor became completely unobstructed. Catherine's future role stood entirely protected from rival power centers, and the royal court returned to a single, absolute line of authority under the king. Charles fully recognized what had been secured for the future, yet he felt absolutely no sense of triumph. After the finalized legal papers were delivered to his desk, he joined Camilla in their private quarters, whispering that the institution was finally secure. The monarch delivered the words softly, with immense care, because the statement carried a profound emotional cost that neither could ignore. She replied that she had once envisioned becoming queen as the ultimate proof that every single year of public mockery, societal rejection, and national judgment had been worth surviving. Now, she recognized that standing by his side without the crown would require an entirely different kind of resilience. Charles promised her that while the decree governed the crown, it had absolutely no power over his love. The crown embodies the statutory authority, public obligation, and immortal institution carried by the ruler, and he had successfully isolated that state power from the marriage they still shared. Camilla picked up the old brass office plate from her writing desk, placed it gently inside a velvet drawer, and slid it shut with absolute finality. Then, she walked with him to dinner, not as a reigning sovereign figure, but purely as the partner he had chosen against all odds. Their marriage endured, though it survived within a completely redefined framework. At the family's subsequent private assembly, William walked straight toward her before she could step aside. The prince welcomed Camilla with genuine warmth, remaining by her side long enough to make the institutional message crystal clear to everyone in the room. Their bond had not suddenly transformed into deep affection, but the old hostility had officially surrendered to mutual recognition, emotional restraint, and ironclad boundaries. She accepted his olive branch, and he fully accepted her permanent place within the family circle. Camilla's historic downfall signaled the absolute conclusion of her queenship, not the destruction of her existence within the inner circle. Charles demonstrated to the world that a sovereign could love with absolute devotion while still enforcing unyielding boundaries when personal desires threatened the safety of the throne.